Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, im Namen der Stiftung Weltethos Schweiz begrüße ich Sie zu dieser dritten Hans-Küng Weltethos Lecture, die jeweils am letzten Montag im November an der Universität Luzern stattfindet. Mit Podcast-Aufzeichnung ist sie zugänglich auf den Webseiten der Universität und der Weltethos Stiftung. Ich heiße Sie alle gleichermaßen herzlich willkommen. Speziell begrüßen möchte ich dennoch Nana Amstadt-Paul, Renata Asal-Steger und Karin Wandeler-Wüst. Sie sind hier in Vertretung des Synodalrats des Kanton Luzern. Ebenso begrüße ich Simon Kurau-Eppli, die Präsidentin des Schweizerischen Katholischen Frauenbundes, sowie Doris Stram, die Vizepräsidentin des interreligiösen Think Tank, und Silvia Stram, Herbert-Haag-Preisträgerin, Rifat Lenzin, Präsidentin von Irach Gottis, der interreligiösen Arbeitsgemeinschaft in der Schweiz. Außerdem heiße ich unter uns willkommen Lena Zoller, die im Dezember die Geschäftsführung der Stiftung Weltethos Tübingen übernimmt. Sie tritt in diesem Amt die Nachfolge des langjährigen Generalsekretärs Stefan Schlensorg an, den auch ich hier herzlich begrüße. Besonders begrüße ich Altbundesrat Schneider-Ammann sowie die Gastgeberin der Universität, Professorin Nicola Ottiger. Der zweite Gastgeber, Professor Peter Kirchschläger, musste seine Teilnahme wegen einer Grippeinfektion kurzfristig absagen. Schließlich ein besonderes Willkommen der Referentin des heutigen Abends, Frau Professorin Azza Karam. Schön, dass Sie hier sind. Das Buch Projekt Weltethos von Hans Küng, für seine Verhältnisse ein vergleichsweise schmaler Band, erschien 1990, vor 35 Jahren also. Die Neue Zürcher Zeitung, damals noch etwas anders zugange als heute, schrieb geradezu enthusiastisch, ich zitiere, in einer Zeit nicht enden wollender Kriege und neuer blutiger Rassenkonflikte, aktueller denn je. Diese eine Welt braucht das eine Ethos. Diese eine Weltgesellschaft braucht keine Einheitsreligion und Einheitsideologie, wohl aber einige verbindende und verbindliche Normen, Werte, Ideale und Ziele. Das knappe, dichte Buch ist eine gewaltige Rede, nicht fern von prophetischer Gebärde. Küng hat sein Buch etwas nüchterner als wie ein Stein ins Wasser geworfen bezeichnet. So etwa wurde in enger Zusammenarbeit mit Küngs Projekt Weltethos in Chicago am 4. September 1993 die Erklärung zum Weltethos durch das Parlament der Weltreligionen veröffentlicht. In der Erklärung, die Küng als Charta, als Grundlagendokument des Projekts Weltethos bezeichnet, werden 4 Weisungen oder Imperative der Menschlichkeit formuliert. Sie lauten: für eine Kultur der Gewaltlosigkeit und der Ehrfurcht vor allem Leben, für eine Kultur der Solidarität und eine gerechte Wirtschaftsordnung, für eine Kultur der Toleranz und ein Leben in Wahrhaftigkeit, für eine Kultur der Gleichberechtigung und der Partnerschaft von Mann und Frau. Im Oktober 2018, am 25. Jahrestag der Erklärung zum Weltethos, wurde diese aus aktuellem politischen Anlass um eine 5. Weisung ergänzt. Für eine Kultur der Nachhaltigkeit und der Sorge für die Erde. An diesen 5 Imperativen der Menschlichkeit orientiert sich auch der erste Zyklus der Hans Küng Weltethos Lecture. So etwa war die letztjährige Veranstaltung der Friedensethik gewidmet und die Lecture 2025 stellt den wirtschaftsethischen Imperativ unter dem Titel Gerechtigkeit ins Zentrum. Dieses Jahr wird Frau Professorin Karam zum Imperativ der Gleichberechtigung und der Geschlechtergerechtigkeit sprechen. Dem Geist von Hans Küng entsprechend, ich sage es immer wieder, ist die Weltethos-Lecture nicht ein rückwärtsgewandter, gewissermaßen dogmatischer oder rezitativ ausgerichteter Anlass. Die Weltethos-Lecture lässt sich stattdessen vom Küngschen Gedanken der Zeitgenossenschaft und der Spurensuche leiten. Eben kein Überleben unseres Globus ohne ein globales Ethos, ein Weltethos gemeinsam getragen von religiösen und nicht religiösen Menschen. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen bereichernden Abend.
Geschätzte Damen und Herren, ein herzliches Willkommen auch von Seiten des Instituts für Sozialethik und des Ökumenischen Instituts Luzern. Sie haben es bereits gehört, mein geschätzter Kollege Peter Kirchschläger musste sich heute Morgen kurzfristig krankheitsbedingt entschuldigen. Wir bedauern dies außerordentlich und danken Ihnen für Ihr Verständnis. Aus dem Institut für Sozialethik wird Matteo Frey, Doktorand an der Luzern Graduate School in Ethics, mitwirken und heute die Diskussion im Anschluss an das Referat auch leiten. Das Thema des heutigen Abends, Equality and Gender Justice, Gleichberechtigung und Geschlechtergerechtigkeit, hat Sie alle angesprochen und hierher geführt. Wir freuen uns sehr über Ihr zahlreiches Erscheinen. Viele treibt das Thema Geschlechtergerechtigkeit um. Manche beschäftigt es sehr stark und auch persönlich. Andere stimmt die Frage nach der Gleichstellung der Geschlechter zumindest nachdenklich. Wieder andere finden es störend und ärgern sich darüber. Vielleicht engagieren Sie sich selbst für Geschlechtergerechtigkeit in Gesellschaft, Politik oder Kirche und sind froh um jede inhaltliche und moralische Unterstützung. Oder Sie haben sich entschlossen, einfach wieder einmal hineinzuhören, was es heute zu Geschlechtergerechtigkeit, vor allem auch im Zusammenhang mit Religion, zu sagen gibt. Tatsächlich betrifft das Thema Geschlechtergerechtigkeit uns alle. Ob Sie sich als Mann, als Frau oder irgendwo dazwischen verstehen. Letztlich kommt wohl niemand früher oder später daran vorbei, sich zu überlegen, was sich privat oder gesellschaftlich ändern würde, wenn man selbst nicht als Mann, als Frau oder irgendwo dazwischen leben würde, sondern als Mann, als Frau oder irgendwo dazwischen. Gesellschaftlich ist das Thema immer präsent. Gestern beispielsweise hat Zürich über den Genderstern abgestimmt. Vor kurzem wurde in Amerika gewählt und nicht wenige hatten den Eindruck, es scheint egal zu sein, was dieser Mensch tut, wie menschen- oder frauenfeindlich er agiert. Er ist als Mann immer noch wählbar und eher wählbar als jede andere Frau. Auch Abtreibung als Wahlkampfthema zeigt, dass mit der Geschlechterfrage durchaus Politik gemacht wird und dass das Ganze auch mit Religion zu tun hat. Und schließlich wissen wir alle, dass tagtäglich und weltweit Frauen stärker als Männer von Armut betroffen sind und dass ihr Zugang zu Recht, zu verschiedenen Ressourcen wie beispielsweise Bildung oder Medizin und so weiter oder ihre Mitbestimmung in Politik und Religion Männern gegenüber immer noch dramatisch eingeschränkt ist. Das Thema, dem wir uns heute Abend widmen, ist ernst. Und es scheint in seiner Tragweite entweder immer noch nicht genügend wahr oder ernst genommen zu werden, oder aber es gibt Gründe, weshalb keine effektiven und nachhaltigen Lösungen gefunden werden für echte Geschlechtergerechtigkeit. Die Referentin der Hans-Küng Weltethos Lecture letztes Jahr, Dr. Tanja Paffenholz, hatte über Friedensethik gesprochen und auch dabei gab es einen entscheidenden Link zur Frauenfrage. Ohne Gleichberechtigung keinen Frieden. Wir dürfen heute eine ausgewiesene und inspirierende Fachperson zur Frage der Geschlechtergerechtigkeit bei uns willkommen heißen, die insbesondere auch die Rolle der Religionen und des interreligiösen Dialogs oder der interreligiösen Dialoge im Blick hat. Ich darf Ihnen unsere Referentin kurz vorstellen. Professor Dr. Azza Karam war bis vor kurzem Generalsekretärin von Religions for Peace. Sie ist aktuell Präsidentin und CEO von Lead Integrity, einem globalen Beratungsunternehmen im Dienst des Gemeinwohls. Lead Integrity bringt Leadership und Kompetenzen von Fachleuten zusammen, die von verschiedenen Religionen inspiriert sind. Professor Karam arbeitet zudem als assoziierte Wissenschaftlerin am Ansari Institute for Religion and Global Affairs der Notre Dame University in den USA. Sie ist Mitglied des hochrangigen Beirates für Multilateralismus des Generalsekretärs der Vereinten Nationen sowie Vorstandsmitglied in verschiedenen Institutionen des interreligiösen Dialogs. Viele Jahre stand Professor Azza Karam selbst im Dienst der Vereinten Nationen, wie auch bei zwischenstaatlichen Organisationen wie etwa der OSZE. Dear Professor Karam, we are both honored and excited to have you with us. We are indeed very fortunate to be able to share in your experiences and your thoughts on where we stand when it comes to gender equality. We are sure that the path you will show us can lead us forward. Please, Professor Karam. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was a good beginning. Peace upon you all. In my culture, we would say Assalamu alaikum, exactly the same, peace upon you all. It's a tremendous joy and privilege for me to be here with you today, and I want to make sure to give due thanks and appreciation to the University of Luzern, both the institutes that have very kindly sponsored me, and especially to the Weltethos Stiftung, the institute that has been enabled this whole lecture series to take place. It is a tremendous privilege to be with you. And if you'll allow me, I do want to elaborate on the privilege of being with you. I do recognize the honor and the responsibility of this opportunity that you have offered me. I don't take either the honor or the responsibility lightly, particularly because of the different wars raging, especially in my Arab region of birth, particularly because of the famines raging also in my region of birth, and particularly in times when international law and order are openly ridiculed by both elected and imposed heads of state, particularly in times when fact and fiction either do not matter or are glaringly manipulated, and most especially, particularly in a time when being a Muslim is often seen as either synonymous with terrorism, at worst, or at best as people whom the Western Hemisphere should take some pity on. I have, in my own career, experienced research, teaching, and leading in service in both international and multi-religious spaces. And I have witnessed many times over what it means to hold multiple identities, which are systemically, individually, and collectively othered, including in the name of peace and justice. So for all these reasons, I do not take lightly the opportunity and the podium that you have provided me with here. And I'm also delighted to be able to be in Luzern. I mean, what's not to love about this place? So in my presentation today, I wish for you to see me as taking you on a journey where we sojourn in different places and spaces. You may know that in the Bible, the term sojourner is used to describe Christians who are not citizens of the world, but are instead temporary residents. And they are expected to exemplify the values of heaven, no less. And they are certainly not expected to adopt the customs of the world. So, just to be clear, I am a person of faith, but I most certainly do not exemplify heavenly values, and I do adopt the values of the world. In fact, I stand here in honor of a visionary man who argued prolifically and powerfully of the necessity of common values for our coexistence. I speak, obviously, of Professor Hans Küng. So I ask you to accompany me both in my various sojourns, places we will stay together, as well as on the journey itself. Before we begin, the very first sojourn, if you will, is a peek into where I am coming from on the matter of religions per se. I invite you to join me for a brief visit to the places then where I see gender and religion coming together. And I ask you to see gender through my eyes, or better still, through a powerful astronomical telescope, but one that is deeply sentient, very high emotional IQ. And then we will meditatively walk together to the places where religions and conflicts supposedly meet today, and from there to interfaith dialogues, the ones meant to realize peace between religions, how they are today, what they look like, and where they intersect with gender justice. In my last sojourn, I will invite you to bear with me as I challenge us all to imagine something different. So, let me share where I come from. I begin with a quote, and it says the following: "There was a time when I blamed my companion if his religion did not resemble mine. Now, however, my heart accepts every form. Love alone is my religion." This is a quote from a chap called Ibn al-Arabi, who lived from 1165 to 1240. Ibn al-Arabi was an Andalusian, from Andalusia, Muslim scholar. He was a mystic, a Sufi. He was a poet. He was a philosopher. And he was extremely influential within Islamic thought. Ibn al-Arabi affirmed the transcendent unity of religions, a kind of unity which is based upon several esoteric and transcendent samenesses, upon which all kinds of belief, even non-belief, are anchored. It is crucial to bear in mind that the term transcendent unity of religions is not only possessed by perennial philosophers, the Sufis, led by Ibn al-Arabi, several centuries before the modern era, echoed the content of the terminology that we call in Arabic wahdat al-adyan, the unity of religions. Dare I say, therefore, that before Hans Küng, there was Ibn al-Arabi. mentioned, there was also Emil Durkheim, whose work on the sacred offers a starting point for a public language about thinking about the moral basis of society. Emil Durkheim's first key move in analyzing moral life was to locate it not in the private inner conscience, which we are all hearing about today, but actually in collective life. He understood the fundamental beliefs which shaped human life as essentially social phenomenon. In his classic study in the elementary forms of religious life, published over 100 years ago, Durkheim wrote that individuals who make up a social group feel bound to one another because of their common beliefs. And belief, as he argued, was not a matter of personal opinion or private religious experience. Instead, it belongs to the group and unites it. Now, Durkheim's perspective can be challenging. It draws us away from thinking about the inner authenticity of a person's belief to thinking about belief as a form of social practice and social experience. But he developed this understanding of the sacred much further. So rather than being simply a way of making sense of the world, the sacred was something that evoked deep emotions in people, giving them a sense of moral energy and conviction. It was something experienced through special forms of collective action. It was not an abstract reference to God, nor a universal mystical presence. It was a living social reality, dependent on social engagement to be charged into a powerful force. Once energized, this sacred could release a powerful structuring influence on social life. I believe that by taking up Durkheim's intellectual project, we may begin to develop clearer ways of understanding the roots and forms of these powerful moral forces, as well as their enduring power in our lives today. And this is what I intend to try to do by sharing my understanding of gender and gender justice. I see gender, and now remember, we're going to the second journey now. We're going to a sojourn of a place that says, what has gender got to do with it? I see gender and gender justice as intrinsically connected with what Durkheim identifies as the deep moral forces of social life, and therefore also with religions and different faiths. So it's not just a social label or even one of the social processes around us. It is about much more: who we are, what we feel, how we live, and how we interact with one another. Much has been written in secular as well as faith-based, largely Christian, by the way, contexts about gender justice. But for the purpose of my presentation, since I speak of both religious as well as more secularized spaces, I am using the definition of gender justice composed and used by the Global Fund for Women. If you don't know what that is, it's one of those excellent funds that offers opportunities and resources for women to undertake a number of different social and professional initiatives around the world. So the term signifies an intersectional, interdependent approach which puts at its center the diverse needs, experiences, and leadership of people most impacted by discrimination and oppression. This approach, according to the Global Fund, helps achieve both equity, which is equal distribution of resources, access, and opportunities, and equality, equal outcomes for all. The Global Fund states that the gender justice framework, I quote, means allowing for movements to define their own priorities and indicators of success to mitigate the harm of discriminatory, racist, and toxic practices by traditional global north philanthropists, institutions, and structures. And if you have a problem with that, take it up with the Global North, with the Global Fund for Women. This reference to toxic practices by the traditional Global North spaces brings us to geopolitics, most especially in this context, to the challenge of realizing a global public good, the global public good. A report by the United Nations Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, it's a heck of a mouthful, which is entitled A Breakthrough for People and Planet, Effective and Inclusive Governance for Today and the Future, provides pretty comprehensive and detailed recommendations to strengthen the global architecture for peace, security, and finance to deliver just transitions for climate and digitalization and ensure more equity and fairness in global decision-making. Along with the recommendations to ensure that the multilateral system, which includes, by the way, civil society and within that faith-based organizations, to ensure that the multilateral system is more networked, more inclusive, and more effective. According to the report, effective multilateralism is only possible if women and men are equally and meaningfully represented. The report argues, effectively, that gender equality needs to be at the heart of a reinvigorated multilateral architecture. In fact, gender equality is noted as the foundation that undergirds the 6 transformative shifts which are required for this breakthrough. It follows, therefore, that no transformative ability to realize the common good is possible without gender justice. Now, you all know that gender is defined as referring to the characteristics, usually of women, men, girls, and boys, which are socially constructed, or so we are told. But frankly, if that's it, then it should be pretty foundational to how we see ourselves, how we understand the world around us, including our physical, political, economic, and social cultural environment, as well as how we perceive one another. Far from being limited to a field of study of sexual relations and identities, gender both informs as well as is informed by our way of seeing, being, and behaving towards one another and the world around us. With this understanding of gender, gender equality is when all people should have total and equal access to all human rights at all times, regardless of their identity, self-image, nationality, ethnicity, race, or sexual orientation, or whatever else is used to divide us and distinguish. So every individual should experience dignity and respect, no matter how they define themselves, or where they happen to be, or who they think they are, or who we think they are. And this applies to everyone, from people of disabilities to young and old, to people of all races. It really shouldn't matter, because ultimately it comes down to the fundamental understanding that we are each and all human. In short, we're actually talking about much more than the social construction of roles. This is about the entirety of our lived experiences as a species. Gender is the foundation that links all the other aspects of our being together. Gender justice, therefore, becomes not only about accepting and I'm not undermining, but it becomes far more than accepting and promoting the rights of LGBTIQ+, but together with relevant attitudes, legislation, and policies. All of that is very important. All of that certainly comes under gender justice. But actually, the argument here is that gender justice should be about enabling a whole of social justice approach. So I see gender justice as transcending sexuality, which is pretty big already, and integrating our attitudes towards interconnected rights and responsibilities as sentient beings. And my argument is that if and when we keep insisting that gender justice is referring only to relationships between men and women and various means and understandings of that, or only about masculine and feminine and various means of that, we're actually behaving more like a hamster running on a wheel inside a cage. The hamster needs to run. The wheel is meant to turn, but the hamster remains inside the cage unless the running of the wheel opens the cage doors, and we can see not only the immediate environment around the cage, but the whole world around us. So gender justice, to me, quite frankly, should be an inviolable part of what Hans Küng believed to be a global ethic, a set of common values and ethical standards that could be shared by all faiths and belief systems. Gender justice is actually, in its most simplistic form, about us all having the same opportunities and responsibilities. And when you think about it, that's exactly what all faiths are meant to represent or to promote. In the eyes of the Creator, we are all equal in our nature. Effectively, all faiths, including indigenous ones that see the sacred in nature, all faiths say that we should have equal access to everything that nature provides us, but we also have the obligation to respect one another and the nature that sustains us. We are responsible for creation. Gender justice is about that responsibility to one another and the creation. The truth is, though, that it's been primarily men who lead institutions and set the tone, both religiously and politically. So yes, of course we have women in politics, yes, of course we have women in religious institutions, but let's face it, the dominant majority remains pretty male. But this, by the way, has not always been the case, as all of you know, much better than I. There have been times, many in human history, where women played key roles in government, communities, religion, philosophy, and absolutely everything else. And then there has been, in every one of those times, a backlash. The more visible women are in positions of responsibility, the stronger the backlash becomes. By the way, it's not just backlash by men. It's also backlash by women. Hildegard von Bingen is just one example of women who not only interpreted, but also served and led communities and created culture in the way she did that. Unfortunately, over time, many women have been sidelined and silenced, and male-dominated structures and institutions, which does not mean it's male-dominated, doesn't mean male-only. Male-dominated structures and institutions have become the centerpiece of all things religion. So if we persist in seeing religions as institutions, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, etc., and even as ordained leaders or as scriptures and stories, and even when we expand that awareness to include religious non-governmental organizations who are doing remarkable humanitarian and development work, we actually still remain very limited in our understanding. We will fail to see how religions inform and are informed by how people see the world, what they believe, and how they behave. And if we see religions outside of the cages we tend to limit them to, we realize that religions and faiths, beliefs, etc., are far more complicated than theological texts, practices, rituals, and whatever else. Rather, we're speaking of complex and complicated lived worldviews, which change as humanity itself changes. But because of the way we have fragmented both religions and gender justice, we often see the influence of religion as either bad, frankly rarely good, for gender justice. I'm guilty of doing this myself. I organized the first debate during the European Union Development Days in 2018. It was the first debate they ever had. And the title, believe it or not, was, "Is Religion Good for Gender Justice?" Now, in broad brushstrokes only, because I can't do justice to the various realms of inquiry, the argument that religions are bad for gender and gender justice often goes something like this. Religious scriptures, which supposedly deny the existence or justification for anything other than male or female, and by extension, noting, for instance, marriage as only acceptable to God when it is between a man and a woman. So to be other than male or female, therefore, according to these prescriptives of the religious, is to be abnormal, abhorrent to God and society, etc. On the other side, the argument that religions are good for gender justice, again, I stand guilty of tremendous generalization here, is that the maker, the creator, the divine, whatever we wish to refer, is merciful and loving, regardless of all the fuss made about our identities. Besides, he made us the way we are, didn't he? And so on. But what if, and here I challenge, what if we see our religions as fundamentally calling for gender justice, indeed as insisting on gender justice, as a whole of justice encompassing all living creation, including our environment? How would this impact on the nexus between religions and conflict? So now we journey together and we come to this religions and conflict area where they meet. One of the great social theorists of the 20th century, René Girard, discusses the problem of violence in our society, the way that so many of our religious and legal rituals are designed to quell the human urge for violence and reassert peace. Here's what he says. It's a bit of a long quote, but it's pretty worth it. Religion instructs men as to what they must, it's not exactly gender sensitive, but bear with me. Religion instructs men as to what they must and must not do to prevent a recurrence of destructive violence when they neglect rights and violate prohibitions. They call down upon themselves transcendent violence, which assumes the role of the demonic tempter, an illusion for which men will continue to fight spiritually as well as physically to the point of total annihilation. We, he's saying, the spoiled children of privilege, consider the God's anger as something illusory. In fact, it is a terrible reality. Its justice is implacable. Its impartiality truly divine. Anger shows no distinctions in its dealings with men. It is at one with reciprocity, with the irresistible tendency of violence to turn against the unfortunate beings who have sought to shape it exclusively to their own uses. And then here's one of my favorite parts. He says, because of their large scale and sophisticated organization, modern Western societies have appeared largely immune to violence's law of retribution. In consequence, modern thinkers assume that this law is and always has been mere illusion, and that those modes of thinking that treat it as real are sheer fantasies. Really? God gets angry? Really? To be sure, these modes of thinking must be considered mythic insofar as they attribute the enforcement of the law to an authority extrinsic to man. But the law of retribution itself is very real. It has its origin in the reality of human relationships. So it may be that God is extrinsic to man, but the way we deal with each other is the way we deal with each other. That was not in the quote. Back to the quote. If we are still strangers to this law, it is not because we have managed to transcend it, but because its application to the modern world has been indefinitely postponed for reasons unknown to us. This, perhaps, is what contemporary history is making clear. End of quote. Now, while the present-day conflicts in Ukraine undermine Girard's argument about modern Western societies being immune to violence's law of retribution, his assertion that it has origins in the reality of human relationships brings us right back to gender and gender justice. In recent decades, religion has assumed some prominence in international affairs. There's a 2007 Economist issue which is actually entitled In God's Name, and it's a special report on religion and public life. The events of September 11, 2001, the conflagration in Iraq, the aggressive assertiveness of quasi-theocratic Iran, the Zionist messianic influence in Israel, and the Russian Orthodox Church's justifications of the war on Ukraine only confirm in the popular mind that religion lies behind much of contemporary international conflict. A common understanding among theorists and scholars, including political pundits, but also among relatively young generation of journalists and thought leaders around the world, is that religious conflicts take place when adherents of one faith take to the extreme and force their religious views on those of other faiths. That's when religious conflicts emerge. In such perception, religious conflicts are reduced to being caused by intolerance against one another's religious understandings or belief systems. So they will tend to see, these kinds of views tend to see the conflict, for instance, between Israel and Palestine as one between Muslims and Jews, which I assure you it is not. They will tend to see the confessional tensions in India and Pakistan as between Hindus and Muslims or Muslims and Christians, respectively. In short order, such perceptions then argue that actually religious conflicts are quite easy to resolve. You just have to know more about one another's religions. Now, this form of simplistic argumentation maintains that religions are meant to create peace and unity among people, but that ignorance is what causes religious strife. And some politicians, goes the view, manipulate the ignorance of the majority to whip religious sentiments. I am not utterly disagreeing with this perspective. I simply think it happens to be a wee bit too simplistic. Others often argue that there is no major religion that is exempt from complicity in violent conflict. Religion is not usually the sole or even the primary cause of conflict, it will be argued. In fact, the argument goes, religions can play a very important role on the side of peacemaking, negotiations, mediation. And, says that view, religious and leaders and institutions can be important communicators between opposing sides in a conflict and provide even trainings in peacemaking methods. So religious communities are also opponents of repression and promoters of reconciliation. Usually, this perspective also reminds us that some of those who have paid a very high price for defending human rights around the world have been religious people, ordained and not. Usually that kind of perspective also then makes a case that interfaith work is very important for peace, nationally and globally. So let's look a little bit, let's sojourn now into this world of interfaith work. And I would remind a quote from Hans Küng, in which he says, "We are conscious that religions cannot solve the economic, political, and social problems of this earth." I use this quote as a reality check before we delve into the realms of interfaith. I should also say that, again, where do I come from? I believe that my Muslim faith compels me to observe all faiths. If Islam is giving into or giving up to the divine in all its forms and manifestations, then one cannot undermine the divine in other people's eyes. It doesn't make sense. And you most certainly cannot serve the divine by undermining his creations or creatures, or their ways of worship. Yes, I know, not everybody thinks like that. It's okay. I'm just telling you what I think. As such, working with and serving all faiths is, in my opinion, not only an obligation, it is the passion of Islam. It is my passion. While at the United Nations, I co-founded 2 entities, a United Nations interagency task force that had over 20 United Nations system organizations in it, and the Multi-Faith Advisory Council. And I can tell you with certainty that when religions come together in service to humanity, mountains can be moved. It's just that we don't often get them to work together in service of humanity. Also important to share with you a distinction between interfaith and multi-religious. A great deal of what we identify as interfaith organizations or institutions or initiatives today are actually, in my opinion, multi-religious initiatives, institutions, and organizations. They bring different religions together around the proverbial table in order to communicate and be in dialogue with one another. It is extremely rare to see these interfaith organizations actually bring the religious representatives, institutions, whatever they have, together to do joint efforts to serve communities. The majority of interfaith work, as we know it today, is about convenings, meetings, which, by the way, are extraordinarily important because wars start when we stop talking to one another. So convenings and meetings are very, very important. Most interfaith organizations do that. They will bring together different religious representatives around a table to talk with one another, exchange knowledge, information, best practices, you name it. Sometimes discuss theology, sometimes discuss issues that are actually pertinent to their joint welfare in a society. However, I think, as you can see from the experience of the United Nations, which has over 65 different entities, one of which is the World Bank Group, I think you can see that the plethora of organizations and sites of engagement is not necessarily resulting in better coordination of services to humankind, let alone a more peaceful coexistence within societies. I think we can all see that. Please don't tell me you want to see more of that. Similarly, having more interfaith initiatives, which are, by the way, mushrooming. Every day you are likely to hear of yet another new interfaith study group, programs in academia, organizations, NGOs, governments, etc. New interfaith initiatives, because this is the era where suddenly people seem to have discovered, especially our politicians, unfortunately, have discovered that interfaith is a pretty interesting thing. These religious leaders might have some sense in them. They certainly are able to get a lot of votes, as former president and president-to-be Donald Trump will tell you. They get a lot of votes, some of them. So there's a discovery. We're living through an era where some have rediscovered the role of religious leaders, religious thought, and religious institutions, big time. Is that necessarily an indicator that religions will play a better role in social cohesion and coexistence? My contention is that that's not enough. Why? Because when you assess how so many different global interfaith organizations today, including the Parliament of World Religions, on whose board I am privileged to sit, who have developed the ethos of Hans Küng's global ethic and have it as a key mandate area, you realize that the term gender and the reality of gender justice are actually not part of the program at all. And this is not just with the Parliament. Most interfaith organizations will deliberately put gender justice off the table, because the argument goes, quite rightly, that the minute you start going into issues of gender and the traditional notions of gender justice actually disrupt. They don't create the room for agreement. That if you put gender on the table, you are creating divisions or the opportunity for divisions. You are not able to build the communal multi-faith table. So, can we have multi-faith efforts that will lead to peace when we refuse to assess social justice through the lens of gender. There are some who will argue quite vociferously that, you know, we don't really need human rights. Many religious leaders will say that, sometimes in private, sometimes in public. We don't need human rights. We have our religious, theological, holy books, traditions, scripture, you name it. We have it. We don't need human rights. Well, the truth is, however, that those who look down on human rights or are ignorant of them, and sometimes some of them will say, oh, these are tools of the West. These are the old colonial tools. We don't need them. But by deliberately blinding themselves to violations of human rights, they are actually violating a global ethic. You cannot be blind to human rights. You cannot dismiss human rights and believe in a global ethic. It doesn't make any sense. There is a phenomenon called the cherry picking of human rights, which governments, nation states, groups, religious institutions do. They'll take one or two rights and they'll say, this we can believe in, this we are committed to, completely forgetting and or perhaps deliberately ignoring that you cannot divide human rights. That the realization of human rights is exactly like the realization of the global ethic, which is based thereupon, is that if you will not realize one set of rights without the other. And the minute you start to prioritize any one or two or even 10 rights, and you forget the other 8, you will not realize human rights. Human rights are indivisible and interdependent. You need the whole of human rights. You need to fight for the whole of human rights in order to realize human rights. And what we are facing today is a situation where human rights has become an endangered species. Interfaith organizations, now let's just see where gender justice and interfaith come together, if they do. Interfaith organizations, particularly those which draw upon the representation and legitimacy of religious institutions among their members. By the way, 3 types of religious interfaith organizations, 3 types, mainly. One type composed of the religious leaders or institutions. They sit on the board, they are the governing board, okay? Another type, purely ordinary folks who are not necessarily religiously ordained, are not necessarily affiliated to religious institutions, and are just people of faith who like to come together because they believe that their faith is telling them and necessitating that they work together. And the third type, which is by far the most popular, which is one which has a mix of both. Some religiously ordained, many lay people together on boards. Now, when you look at how issues of gender or gender justice are even referred to in interfaith organizations, you are very likely to hear this potential refrain. We love our sisters, we love our wives, our mothers, something like that, which apparently means that they are very gender sensitive. As if loving one's female relatives was an act of favoring women, and let alone seeing them, and treating them as equals in rights and responsibilities. Have you, by the way, noticed that there are very few women who will come around and say, including religious ordained leaders who are women, who will actually say that because they love their men, brothers, fathers, husbands, therefore they see them as equals. It's actually quite a bit of an illogical argument, because justice is not about loving the men and women around our family. I mean, of course it is that, but it is also a great deal more. It's about believing that regardless of sex and sexual identity or under any feature of dissonance or diversity, all living creatures deserve a fair chance to live and live with access to all their needs together. Usually, the interfaith nature will require faith leaders who are prepared to accept the inherent dignity of other faiths. That's how they come to the table, that's how they talk as equals. And they are generally comfortable in one another's presence. Those groups who do that, I see as very special faith leaders, actually. They're perhaps the ones who are most merciful towards themselves, their communities, and one another. Yet even among these fairly special types of religious leaders, which includes ordained and non-ordained, men and women, it's actually very rare to see them speak for gender justice. They may pay lip service to it, but they very rarely will work together for it. Same thing applies to human rights. These very special faith leaders will speak pretty favorably about human rights, but when put to the test, there's one particular human right which often goes awry, gets dropped off. Again, it's the ones to do with gender. There's a few questions that we need to ask ourselves about interfaith. Can the global ethic be, is it serving as an interfaith manifesto? If it is, how come it is not part of the lexicon, the strategic directions, framings, the programs, and the initiatives of all of the world's leading interfaith organizations? How come it isn't part of every single interfaith initiative? And is it enough in our day and age to have interfaith dialogues only as conversations? That we sit around and we are together. Of course it's important. Is it enough? Why do we not see more multi-faith projects, initiatives in development, in humanitarian work? Why are we not seeing more multi-religious collaboration? And who and where are interfaith organizations held accountable? Who holds interfaith organizations accountable? We've heard where churches and certain religious leaders get held accountable by law. Which interfaith organization has been held accountable to date for their work? Now, let's look at gender justice, and this is the last sojourn, I promise. Let's step away a little bit from the world of monotheism, right? Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Let's step into the realms of the original faith traditions, indigenous traditions and language. I live in North America, so please allow me to speak to the indigenous traditions of North America. In this context, interconnectedness itself, the fact, the act, the reality of being interconnected is itself sacred. So sacred isn't God, sacred is being connected to one another. Traditional Native Americans feel a sense of interconnectedness at a very deep level. They connect the physical to the emotional, to the spiritual, within each other, as well as with the natural world. All are interconnected. The whole community of creation is connected to their sense of civic responsibilities and governance. In indigenous thinking, there is no such thing as separating one part of our life from another. The Lakota Indians are quite clear that they maintain very clearly that some of the most basic structures to them were the warrior societies. Remember, war, conflict. Yet there existed and remains a lifeway of harmony expressed through a belief in the interrelatedness of all things. The Lakota give credence to the idea that all people and things are related to one another, which opens us, if you think about it, to immense possibilities. What if we once again saw ourselves as family to the whole community of creation? We would come to the realization that all our world exists relative to one another and to our planet. By realizing the connectedness of humankind to all animal and plant life, the Lakota believe that we become aware of new possibilities for preserving all living things. In humanity's dependence on the earth, the Lakota and others believe we can learn to sustain our planet and find fresh prospects for nurturing food, conserving water, and developing renewable energy. This is encapsulated in their two simple prayer words. mitakuye oyasin, which means all my relations. The Iroquois philosophy seeks to bring all people together in one accord by realizing that all people and creation are interconnected. This way of living is natural. This way of thinking is sacred to indigenous people. So I want to end by posing two contentious questions. I should have told you in the beginning that I meant to be contentious, but anyway, better late than never. What if, my question is, what if we were to realize that our religions, faiths, beliefs, whatever we call them, especially those from the Judeo-Christian Muslim traditions, have been actually, over the decades, limited to judging as bad or good or inconsequential, and actually become more focused on regulating our sexualized gender identities. They're perhaps more about seeking, rather than about seeking or demanding a balance between all forms of life, so that no one life or one way of life or one worldview is better than another, as long as we're able to secure access to resources, opportunities, and nurturing payback, i.e. justice, for all, including the planet we live on. What if a global ethic, which would help to achieve peace between religions, as Küng advocated, demands that religions make peace by serving gender justice as an indivisible part of human rights? What if? Thank you.